It seems like a simple question, but who would you buy a house with?
Well, wife, family, things like that.
Oh, your category is bigger than I'm thinking. We're going to talk about this today. Okay, so your first answer, wife. Mm-hmm. The pretty easy one.
Yeah.
What did you say after that?
Well, family. Okay. I think some people...
What scenario would that be?
Kids.
Oh, kids. Okay.
Possibly.
Expand on this. Like, what could you see as a potential?
Well, it's like, grandma, house in the back, that kind of thing. Mother-in-law house, something. Okay.
This is, you're spot on for our topic today.
Okay.
Because you know how I do this. I take these scenarios that are happening that we're seeing in the market. I bring them to the show. I had 2 people contact us in the last week that were selling a house with multiple owners, and the easiest way to say it, with multiple owners that were not romantically involved with each other. So these were like different parties, either friends that owned a house or relatives that owned a house that were now disposing of it. And so I did a little bit of research on this. And Realtor.com recently did a study that said 15% of Americans have purchased homes with a non-romantic partner. And then because of, and I think a lot of people know this, it's pretty apparent, but 7 in 10 Gen Zers have responded that they would consider purchasing a home with somebody that was not a romantic partner. Now that makes a lot of sense to me, because what do we hear all the time from Gen Z right now about homes and prices?
They're too expensive.
They're too expensive. And so they're trying to find the cool kids, I'm told by my kids, call this house hacking, John. So they're trying to find house hacks so that they can find a way to purchase property. And so that was a big number for me. 7 in 10 Gen Zs. This is going to be our next wave of buying that's coming up. And so a lot more people are considering this than have in generations past. Also, there's been companies that have been advertised. I don't know if you might have seen the Facebook ads or the TikTok ads. Maybe I just see them all because I'm in real estate and research real estate a lot. But there's a company out there called Picasso. And what they are selling and kind of their business model is home ownership of second homes in a co-ownership model. So it's kind of a different take on the age-old classic timeshare, right? But in this case, what they're doing is they're actually purchasing a standalone single-family house. A lot of these are in vacation markets on the beach. They're purchasing those in an LLC, so they're putting them in a limited liability company. And then their model generally then sells 8 shares of that house.
Oh.
And you can buy multiple shares, so you don't have to just buy 1/8. You could buy 2, 3, 4. You could buy 4 of the shares and then have rights to basically half ownership of that property.
So what they do is they take the price of the house and chop it up 6 or 8 ways and sell it.
Yep, exactly. And then, for somebody, especially when we're looking like at a second home, for somebody in that situation, you look at second homes, that they're very, very expensive. You also look at the time that you're there. And so you're like, gosh, maybe I am only there, a quarter time of the year. So, how is that house being utilized, the other 3 quarters? And so you can kind of do a cost benefit analysis of how that works. Now, what are the downside to some of these situations that we need to look at? Well, for instance, in that Picasso example, for certain, who gets it for Christmas? So you've got 8 different owners, and so they have a schedule to figure this out. They manage the property, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it. But holidays become an issue. When you can actually get a way to use it. Does your job allow flexible vacation times to be able to do it? So that method is very, very specific to vacation homes. But what John was talking about, which is more prevalent even in our local market, is situations where you have, say, multi-generational families. Like we've seen that a lot in our market. You've started to see homes being built with basically homes within homes. So you've got, separate entrances for bedrooms. You've got a smaller kitchen in a basement, say, suite that has its own access. In fact, just at the Parade of Homes this year, we saw garages that had multiple entrances into the houses, some of those into separate suites. And so you start to look at that and you're like, okay, what's happening in these situations? How are these homes being purchased? So that's where you start to go down the ownership of it. And here's where, trust me, because we're going to talk about this, I see this on the problem side of things when people come to sell and they have not structured the deal properly. What I mean by that is, number one, looking at ownership structure. So a lot of times people don't even pay attention to how they're taking title to a property. And, I can give you the basics of different types of title, but you would have to speak to an attorney and a title expert about that. Because, for instance, just some very basic ones is you can be joint tenants with somebody. So if you have like a joint tenancy with somebody, then there's going to be what's called rights of survivorship. So a lot of times a property will pass, like a husband and wife, and one will pass away. The rights of that ownership passes automatically to the other owner.
Okay.
You could also take title to a property in what's called tenants in common. Now, this is very, very different because with a tenants in common situation, they are going to have a specified share, and that share is not going to transfer automatically to the other owners. That share is going to be in a situation where that can be inherited or that can be sold.
Okay.
So when you look at that situation in a co-ownership situation with somebody, all of the sudden they pass away or they're not the owner anymore. You now have a property where you could end up in very close proximity to somebody you don't know, right? Like this was all fine and dandy when you entered into the situation with the original purchaser.
Yeah.
But now we've had something happen that you couldn't control, and you have to have a mechanism for that. So the very first thing that I wrote down with a lot of people that I see in this situation happen is the financial arrangements. Who is putting the down payment down?
Yeah.
And if there is a mortgage on the property, who is going to be responsible for the mortgage? Is it going to be all parties equally? What if there is an unfortunate death like we talked about?
Yeah.
What if somebody gets into financial trouble and then can't make the payments on the mortgage? But if both people are on the mortgage, now the other person's credit is being negatively affected in that situation. So the biggest thing about this is you have to talk about these situations going into it. And then it's not just the mortgage, it's like monthly expenses. What about lawn care? What about utilities? A lot of these properties don't have separately metered utilities.
Yes.
Now,
so they all have to be divided.
Exactly. And so you have to look at how are we going to divide up the utilities? Are we going to be able to install different flow meters that can measure different parts of the house? Are we going to install separate meters? A lot of times if it's just a multi-generational situation, mom and dad or kids, some of this can be done within the family. But like I said, there's an old saying in business and contracts, and that is that you can't agree to agree later. Like that's not a contractual term. You can't say, you know what, we'll agree on this later. That is not that you can't
it doesn't
force
work
you
that
can't
way.
force agreement. And so you have to look at this and say, okay, well, we might all be comfortable with how it is now, but if these 5 or 6 scenarios happen, how are we going to split this all up? So that's a big one. Another one people don't think about sometimes is what happens if somebody gets into a divorce situation. And so then one of those spouses moves out, but then they are also trying to determine how are they going to split up their estate, and then how is that going to affect the co-owned property?
Yes.
And so you really, really got to pay attention to that. Also, emergency funds. I see what happens a lot of times in these situations is, especially if there's a younger family and an older family, sometimes people aren't as well established financially. And so when you look at that and you say, like, what if a major fixture goes out? And one of the owners wants to finance a portion of that. Another one does not want to do financing. How are we going to handle major fixtures that have a problem in that situation? Number one thing that I tell people in this situation is get some legal advice in a situation like this. I talk about this all the time in this business. And the fact of the matter is that this is likely going to be one of the biggest financial purchases, transactions that somebody is going to do in their lifetime.
Yes.
When it involves real estate. And I know it seems expensive when you're putting down a down payment and there's closing costs and stuff. I know it seems expensive in that situation, but having some sort of co-ownership agreement where an attorney has walked you through what this looks like it can absolutely be a game changer in these situations. They're going to present scenarios to you that you have never even thought of in that situation. And then they are going to have very, very strict guidelines of what mechanisms come into play. So, John, we've been talking about co-owning properties.
Yes.
Okay. And I got to tell you, one of the things that I wrote down that I've seen in these situations is I wrote down living arrangements and house rules. And under occupancy, I put down just having a discussion about who will live in the house and whether the rooms are shared or private. Because just some examples I've given, I've seen in the past. Maybe there's a tragedy, in the family. Dad becomes a widow, kids are looking to buy a house. So they decide to buy a house together. And all is fine and dandy until a couple years later, Dad gets a new girlfriend.
Yeah.
And the kids, as you can imagine, John, are not as big of a fan. Mm-hmm. So how does that situation play itself out? Who can live where? Who can be where? What does that look like? That's just one example of many that I have seen over the last couple of years. Or one of the person, they decide to travel. So for a couple of years, this worked out great. They were living in the ADU back there. And then they decide to travel. Well, we're going to be gone for 2 years traveling. So, you know what? I think we should rent that out. Well, then if that's not discussed beforehand, the other party in the rest of the house or the main, do they have final say on who the occupants are, who the tenants are? Do they get to decide what that is? If they've been sharing the backyard, it's one thing when grandma and grandpa are running around in the backyard, and it's another thing when it's a tenant that they never expected to be living there is also, in the backyard. So a lot of these situations are things that you have to have a plan for and discuss up front. Some of the things I deal with in the business on my side of things is deciding under what conditions the house is going to be sold. So like if you look at this situation and you're a Gen Zer and you're gonna work in, you're gonna work in Tri-Cities and everything's gonna be great, or whatever city you're in, and then all of a sudden it's 3 or 4 years later, you do a career change and you have to move to another part of the country. And so when you decide to move, you want to sell, you want to get some of this equity. The reason why you bought the property co-ownered in the beginning is so that you could get equity faster. So you say to the other party, like, hey, I'm moving to Florida now. We need to sell so I can get my equity out. Mm-hmm. Okay, so a lot of these agreements you have to look and see, like, okay, a lot of times they will put in what's called a first right of refusal in there, so that the other co-owner has first right at buying the other half of the property. Makes sense, right? Because they already live there. Well, how are we going to establish what that value is, John?
Well, you take the value of the house and divide it up among the number of co-owners.
Yeah, maybe. But what if the price of the house is increased? Who's going to decide? Is it going to be your friend Lance Kenmore that you've done the radio show with the last 10 years? Or do we need to call an appraiser?
You need to call an appraiser.
If we do call an appraiser, who's going to pay for that? So you have to just kind of look at all that and kind of go through the different situation and what's happening there. And if it's spelled out in the beginning, everybody has agreement. It's really easy to pull that piece of paper out and say, hey, you know what? We said we were going to have it appraised.
Yes.
And then you will have the first right at buying at that appraisal price. And then if not, then we move on to a sale situation where it's unfortunate, but that one person forced the sale. But we're going to have to move on to a sale situation. The biggest thing that I see here that I wrote down is I said, put timelines that are required in that agreement. Because a lot of times what happens in these situations is one person says, hey, I'm ready to sell. I'm moving to Florida for that job. I got to get out of here. So let's price it. The realtor said to price it at $450. So let's get this thing priced and get it moving. And they're like, whoa, well, wait a minute. Hold on. I think it's worth $480. And just because you're moving to Florida doesn't mean we should fire sale it. So let's start at $480. So you start at $480, but then it's not selling. So then now you're 60 days on the market, 90 days on the market. And the guy that's moving to Florida is like, look, I knew we should have priced it at $450. I got to get this equity and get moved. Yeah. And so if you don't have a timeline in that situation and how to deal with it, this is where a lot of these disagreements come up, and we see a lot of conflict in those situations. So really just have those buyout terms, timelines, all agreed upon up front. And, when you sit down with a good attorney to write this stuff out, yes, it's really, really annoying on the front end, but on the back end, it saves
much better
days and days of disagreements. Plus, not only disagreements, the legal fees up front that you don't want to pay, that, $400 an hour for your attorney or whatever for 3 or 4 hours, are way cheaper than what I see people have to go through on the back end of these situations. So that's a big one. And then the last thing that a lot of these agreements have that I write out with people, and that is much like we have in the realtor industry and stuff, look at putting a clause in there to resolve the conflicts that we haven't thought about. We've just barely tip of the iceberg on this show today. But they will usually put in some sort of dispute resolution mechanism, and that's either arbitration on how they're going to do that versus like legal, somebody suing somebody. So if you have a mechanism in there for conflict resolution, pay attention to that as well. There's a lot of reasons where co-ownership can be beneficial, and I've seen this work, and have very, very positive benefits in a lot of situations. But unfortunately, in what I do, I come in when somebody needs to sell the property, and too often I see where they didn't have this spelled out correctly on the front end of the agreement. And so then we're dealing with that and cleaning that mess. And in that situation, I always see somebody kind of walk away very, very unhappy. And so I just caution people, this is a great way to build equity and get into a property, but it's not all TikTok and Instagram amazingness. Yeah. So when you're seeing this out there, just budget a few extra fees for good title company, good escrow company, good attorney to review, and then a good agent to help you decide what's going to be sellable at the end of the agreement. So co-ownership agreements, a lot of people are starting to look into those. If you have any additional questions at all, go to kenmoreteam.com and shoot me a message. And man, we're busy. It's like I said, rates are down, and we've had great weather. It's a great time of year. There's still plenty of time to get things sold or get a property bought in 2025. And we're on that fourth quarter push. So go to kenmoreteam.com, shoot us a message. We'd love to help.